I'm super excited to present to you one of the most exciting rounds, not just in chess candidates history, but in chess tournament history. Hey there, it's GM Max, and today we are going to recap round 2 of the candidates tournament. And as you can see here, already, we had a first decisive game played between Nakamura against FIDE. Of course, to win with the black pieces, especially against a player of Nakamura's caliber, is certainly something quite special. So let's see how FIDE did it. It started out with pretty normal Berlin as such. It is true that the move d5 is another idea of Kramnik that started to become popular in the last years, and actually in one of the later games we will see black play the move d5 and get that more open and direct kind of play. But FIDE decides to play the main line, just very solid d6, building the stable pawn chain. And after h3, knight to e7, and the move d4, which was trying to disrupt a little bit black's usual plan of playing knight g6. Now, normally here, black just plays bishop b6, because if white takes on e5, you just take back and you have absolutely no problems in the arising open position with the pressure against f2 and so forth. But FIDE came prepared with a little bit of a surprise, playing this move of c6 here. A little bit of an intermezzo against the bishop. If you are enjoying this video, by the way, do make sure to leave a like and also consider subscribing. The point of c6, in case you're wondering, is that if white were to take the bishop, yeah, it's true that black is sacrificing a pawn on d6. But it turns out the pawn is a little overextended, where black will be able to steadily regain it with bringing his pieces around like so. And after something like, let's say, if they play rook e1 to defend this pawn, we can kind of see that, black does have a pretty stable position. And when they do eventually get around to regaining this pawn, it's not a forced line, but just to kind of show how the position might play out as such. Around here, black is going to get the pawn back, like rook c6, queen d7, this sort of thing. And, black is basically going to be more or less okay in that instance. So in the game, Nakamura decided to play bishop d3. And, you might already notice he spent like 20 minutes already on the first 9 moves, which is, it's sort of an indication he was quite surprised here. And I think normally speaking, the normal move would just be to play knight d2 and, just play a very standard kind of main line, with both sides just putting their pieces on healthy squares. The line kind of goes on from here, but let's not get too carried away. But instead, there's the question of, well, what if white just takes the free pawn with takes, and knight takes e5, which is what Nakamura did in the game. And now came a real hammer blow from black in the move of bishop takes h3, which at first glance appears to be just a blunder, but it turns out to be not so simple, because after takes, black has this move of queen to b8, and the reason we choose b8 and not d6 or c7, so the first point note is white can't just move the knight away, because we do have the move queen g3, and we do get a pretty crushing attack in this case. Something like this is just not something that white can afford to allow as such. Rook d3 is a threat, and if you play f3 to cover it, there's already various winning moves, but like knight h5 and just bring the knight in the attack will be the simplest. So you can't really do that as white. You do have to give back the piece in some form. Of course, f4 is not possible because of the pin, so white's basically left with bishop f4. And now, because the queen is on b8 specifically, we have the move bishop c7, which allows black to regain the piece, and after something like bishop h2, take f4, bishop c7. Position is about equal, sort of dynamically speaking. White's got the bishop pair and some space, but white has one extra pawn island, and the king is a bit unsafe in the long term. So definitely a position with chances for both sides, where the better player is probably going to win in general. But Nakamura thought that he could be a little bit creative here and anticipate the queen b8 idea by playing knight c4 first. This intermezzo, however, proves to be not so effective, and FIDE really played very well to show why it's not so great to play knight c4. He played bishop g4 first, gaining a tempo on the queen, and after queen to c2, he decided to keep his bishop alive with bishop c7, which does make a lot of sense. A move like knight g6 is also pretty strong, just kind of making the point that the white king is actually a lot weaker on the dark squares on the king side than it may initially seem. But yeah, bishop c7 perfectly fine as well. The only drawback really is that white does have the option of e5, and this is all what happened in the game. But Vidic showed quite well why this is not such a big concern. You can also put the knight on d5, it also works, but yeah, the idea of putting the pressure on e5 is certainly quite natural here. And after this, yeah, in hindsight, we could probably say bishop d3 is not the best defense, but it's already a tough position for white to play. Moves like queen e4 and, giving up the bishop, which is what the engine suggests, is definitely not a natural approach to put it mildly. And even then, black's still just going to be better here with, just being up a piece for 2 pawns in a sense. But yeah, in the game, bishop d3, very natural move to ensure bishop doesn't get trapped. The problem is that, okay, computer is saying f5 is very good for reasons a bit beyond my understanding, but the move b5 also gave an advantage in the game. Knight takes e5, and yeah, the bishop is coming under fire, and white probably already has to cut his losses by taking and trying to neutralize the pressure a bit this way. Still, I mean, black is going to just be ripping open the king, and white's got his work cut out to survive even here. But after bishop e2, and now very nice move f5 to keep the tension and potentially open the file for the rook. Yeah, it turns out white is basically just lost here, where after the move f4, which is what white had pinned his hopes on. There's many good moves for black, but black found the really most beautiful way to win in bishop to b6. Letting white take the knight, because then we go knight d5, and white just doesn't have a good way to defend the knight from the attack. And also in the game after king f2, trying to anticipate knight d5, but it came anyway, and even flicking in the rook h1 check doesn't really help. Here as well, white is simply unable to save his piece. If he does play a move like queen d3, there's a lot of winning moves here as black, like even just f4 and just using this pin is going to be really problematic, actually, among other things. White played king e1 in the game, and yeah, the rest was pretty straightforward. I mean, there isn't really any question with all white's piece on the queen side stuck here that black is going to win, and after a few more precise moves to bring the final pieces into the attack. And note, by the way, white doesn't just have knight d2 because, well, we can play knight c4, and this pin is a big problem. But in the game after b3 and knight f1, black is just going to pick up the exchange with the knight g3 fork and just have a completely decisive advantage then. And for this reason, Nakamura resigned. So definitely a big blow for Nakamura's chances where, yeah, it's a 14-round tournament, so there's still time to come back in theory. But at the same time, yeah, losing with white is obviously not ideal, and it's, yeah, quite clear that, white had a bit of an off day in this game. While Vidic, yeah, has sort of shown himself to be in really good form for this tournament, so it'll be interesting to see how things progress for both players. With that being said, let's move on to the next game here, the second game of 4. And yeah, you're going to probably figure out fairly soon, why I said this is one of the most exciting rounds in tournament chess history. And this game was maybe not the most interesting as some of the others, but I think it's actually in some ways maybe the most instructive, in fact. Where in this game between Caruana against Abbasov, we had e5, castles, bishop d6. Fair enough, I actually wrote a survey on this system like a long time ago, like almost a decade ago, in UN Chess Yearbook, where back then I was kind of focusing more on these positions after take, and sort of exploring how like these variations play out essentially. But nowadays, theory kind of established that white's a bit better here because of the isolated pawn on d7. So with modern engines, the attention's shifted more towards a6 and kind of flicking in these intermediate moves and basically playing in much more of a Roy Lopez kind of spirit. Where in this version, like d4 is not as effective because take, and when all the exchanges happen, the big difference with the bishop being on c2 is that queen c7 is now going to win a pawn and shift this from being slightly better to white to just being fine for black here. So this is kind of the reason why some other moves have been tried where d4 is quite a dangerous gambit that can be explored in your own time. But Caruana, playing a lower-rated player, says, well, let's just play normal happy chess, just d3. and just outplayed the opponent on technique. Now, maybe one reason that Basov went for this is maybe because Caruana had lost to Magnus Carlsen in the Bishop G5 variation, where Carlsen outplayed him very, very nicely in that game. Of course, so, Caruana had done his homework since, and came ready with this different approach of H3, where when you play an approach like this, you're obviously not really fighting for the maximum advantage, let's say, as white. But on the other hand, it's also very, solid and flexible. All of white's moves make sense. And black kind of isn't able to get some dynamic chances quite so easily as such. After the move a6, white has a bit of an interesting choice where you could either play and retreat the bishop, but, sort of allowing black to grab some space and potentially get rid of your bishop with knight a5 at some point. Something like this is only going to be, I think, a touch better for white. And I do like the way Caruana played it with bishop c6, just transitioning into a structure that's almost more like a kind of anti-Berlin with the pawn on c5. It also has a lot of similarities to the g6 Rossolimo, but where the bishop is on d6 rather than g7, which definitely creates some interesting strategic contours. So knight h4 was a nice move by Caruana. Pretty standard plan in these structures, just put the knight on f5 and have that support of that pawn chain on the light squares, which we might know is also kind of constricting the light squared bishop a bit for black, whereas our bishop is quite well complemented by the pawns on the light squares. Black now played the move g6, and none of these moves are sort of obviously bad by black by any means, but somehow white just manages just to get this quite pleasant position in the game. Knight h5 makes a lot of sense as well. Trade off the bishops, make it a bit harder for white to get in that f4 break. Knight f3, b6. I mean, there's a lot of different plans you can go for here. Caruana plays a move a3, trying to open up some ideas of b4. To which a fairly thematic reaction, and probably the one Abbasov should have played, is just a5 and just trying to hold back that b4 move to some extent. Although white would still be able to play the same ways in the game to fairly good effect. Where after b5, which is not the worst move possible by any means, but you are kind of weakening the c5 pawn a bit, let's say, and you're putting another pawn on a light square, which constricts the c8 bishop a bit. But the idea of knight e2 is basically clearing the way to prepare the f4 break. And after bishop e6, f4, and the exchanges ensue on f4, we can see white basically has a dream position here, where the bishop has no real targets, white has a much more flexible structure, and very clear targets to pry at on f6 and c5. And if black plays a move like c4 trying to liquidate the tension, it does undouble the pawns, but at the price that, the black structure is going to be quite weak in this case, where the double pawns become much more of a weakness in this instance. Still, considering how passive the position ended up becoming for black, it's possible that maybe c4 and exchanging one disadvantage for another may have given the best chances to defend successfully. But of course, rook a8 as playing game is by no means a mistake either. And at this point, this is kind of an interesting moment of the game where the best move for white is probably to play rook a to f1. And I think that Caruana didn't play it because he was wanting to have this a file open for the rook, like when he plays b4 later. But it turns out after rook f8 that actually, as weird as it looks, you can actually even play b4 in this position here, where you're still able to kind of get this sort of grip over the dark squares that Caruana was kind of going for in the game as such. And black can't really take the pawn because then, well, it turns out rook f6 is actually not so simple, but Caruana's idea is actually would be to play e5 in this instance, where you're able to get that pawn on f6, and this attack is basically going to be winning. We can just bring the knight and bring the queen in, and it's very, very tough for black to survive here. The move queen f2, not a terrible move, but it is true that over the course of the game, white did lose quite a bit of his advantage, where he played b4 in this version, which I suppose in this case c4 maybe has a bit more merit compared to a few moves ago, but I do still like the move cb4 played in the game, where black realized you should try to create some sort of counterplay, because if you let white just, build up with, queen e3, c3, d4, and, this sort of thing, it's going to be very tough for black to sort of defend in a way. So black played rook a8, sort of preparing the move a5. You could also make the point that rook c8 and c5 might be a possibly more precise version of the same idea, but maybe you just didn't want to allow d4 and this grip over the c5 square as such. But yeah, after rook a8, white just played king h1, which maybe is a slightly lazy move in the position, where probably going knight f3 and just bring knight to d4 as soon as possible. It's probably going to be the way to maximize white's edge here, but king h1 was played, and after ba5, I think that if black plays rook a5 and just simply recaptures, he's probably doing fine here. I'm thinking what might be the thing that Abasov was concerned about here. Maybe he didn't like something like e5 and the knight coming in this way, using the pin on the file. But it turns out you can sort of play around the knight, where like a knight on d6, it looks nice, but it's not as much of a problem as it might appear. Like we can sort of play around the knight and have some counterplay on the queen side to more or less be surviving here. The move c5, yeah, is maybe just not as precise, where white is able to sort of hang on to his extra pawn. After e5, yeah, I mean, some of these moves weren't absolutely the most precise, like the idea of c3, and trying to push the pawns forward might have been a possibly more promising route. Although even here, I guess black does get the pawn back, so again, I can sort of understand the reluctance to go for this. But yeah, e5 allowed black to go f5, and we don't have the knight e4 trick anymore, so that's why I'm maybe not quite as keen on e5 here. But Caruana did have a plan, and I do really like his next move of c4, which is preparing to move knight b3 to defend the extra pawn, and it also, very much in the Soviet style, fixes the pawn on c5 as a weakness. So it's one of these positions where, the computer will tell you that after g5 and queen to g3, just keeping the pin on the king, the computer will tell you that black's doing fine here if he plays it correctly. But black does have to be a little bit precise here, and there are some sort of subtle differences between the different moves. So what black should have done is, in hindsight, he should have played the move king to h8, breaking the pin and preparing the, capture on c4. The point of this being, if rook takes f5, at first it might seem like the pawn is a bit of a sore point, but it turns out black has a little trick of g4 that actually gives him a decent game. The point being, after takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and queen h4, that, we're able to, either get in queen g4 and, sort of regain the pawns and basically survive with our counterattack. Or if they play queen h3 trying to hang on to everything, it turns out that, this ending, white does have an extra pawn here, which, does count for something. But it's just going to liquidate, where these pawns will get traded and black will end up with a 1 versus 2 holding rook endgame. For example, something like e6, rook a1. I mean, e6 isn't the best try for white, but it sort of demonstrates this point that one way or another, these pawns are likely to get swapped off, and then the draw becomes kind of obvious in a way. So instead of this, black played h6, and yeah, the difference now is that you don't have that g4 trick anymore, which means that basically white is going to keep the extra pawn in a sense. Still, if black plays queen e6, like forks these two pieces and, keeps his pieces active, black does still have some chance to save the game, just because his bishop is currently quite a bit better than the white knight, which is a little passive for the moment. And black can also try to bring the rook around this way. Like, white does have some weaknesses of his own to sort of counteract the exposed black king. But unfortunately in the game, after, defending reasonably well to this point, black kind of blundered with bishop b3, and I think it was just sort of a bit of a panic, would be my guess, because, yeah, basically after rook af1, there's just no good defense to the rook coming into f7. If you play rook a7 to try and cover it, white will just go e6, and, it's sort of a general point when the minor pieces are traded and you only have the major piece on the board. The king safety and the piece activity are the big factors, and, white is just crushing on both elements here. In the game after king h8, rook f7, black just resigned here, because if you do play queen e5 and take the pawn, rook f8 and it's just going to be mate, and yeah, it's also clear what else black can really do. So, very nice win by Caruana. There are definitely a couple of messy moments to the game, but I think the overall plan of white getting this position, it's very instructive for understanding why the Rossolimo is such a great practical weapon, and white is currently considered slightly better for white by modern opening theory. But that's, I guess, another story. For our third game, this one was a very sharp, very dynamic game where you definitely feel watching it that it could have gone either way. But Gukesh, played very well, I think, to neutralize some very creative attacking attempts by Prague. So with this E6 move order, like if you're wondering why people might use this move order rather than, let's say, the Nimzo move order, like one of the points is that in this case, white can play G3 and sort of go bishop G B4 and just sort of play moves like knight D2 where black is still fine. You're sort of giving white this extra option where obviously you can't take the pawn because queen A4 is going to win a piece as such. Whereas if you compare with this version in the game with black playing the classical queen's gambit decline move order, well, now knight b2 isn't so appealing anymore because queen a4, knight c6 is going to sort of hang on to the extra pawn as such. Which is why normally people just play bishop d2 and you get this classical main line where you've sort of avoided the knight d2 e4 plan that's common in these middle games by luring their bishop to d2 first, as it were. But in the game, Prague played knight c3, transposing back into the Romanician Nimzo. That is the Nimzo Indian where white is playing g3 on move 4. And after knight c6, you could say that black definitely has an improved version of the Catalan in one sense, because so with the knight on c3, it's much harder to regain the pawn with a move like queen c2, for example. And queen a4, doesn't really regain the pawn either, because you can play knight d5 and defend it in that way as such, which is actually an old main line from like 2018. But in the game, Prague decides to play something a bit less theoretical, playing the move a3. It takes, white does sort of get some play down the file, and white definitely has compensation in this case. So black goes bishop e7, just playing it solidly, and you're heading back to more of a queen's gambit decline type of position. And with the move e4, we can sort of see that white is basically not really trying to regain the pawn, but is just relying on his strong center to give good compensation. And to sort of approach it, like objectively speaking, black probably has the better side of equality with the extra pawn. But white succeeds getting a very fighting position where he has good chances to, for a decisive result in any case. And, well, as we can see, it didn't go his way this time, but certainly in a nice spirit for the spectators. And, well, white wants to go d5, like this is really his plan, to go d5 and just take the initiative in the center. So Gukesh just anticipates that with knight a5, which also sort of shows a very subtle drawback of a3, where it's not like the biggest factor in the world, but it is true that b3 does then become a potential outpost for the black knight later in the game. After d5 and takes, the normal move would just be to play something like e takes d5 or knight takes d5 here. But in this case, I mean, black has pretty comfortable play. Like, we're already threatening bishop c5 moves to use the pin. And, it's clear that black is the one who has sort of got the advantage in this instance, where, we're sort of also avoiding, like, knight d4, knight c6 by covering it that way. So white played the move e5 instead, which, maybe isn't the favorite of the engine, but I think it gives the best practical chances here. Because the point of this pawn sack, well, it's a second pawn sack even, but the idea is that after fe6 and knight d4, that it's not going to be so easy for black to defend this pawn comfortably, because bishop h3 is also a thing. And after queen d6, I think that white still has to go bishop f4 and try to regain the pawn this way. And it's actually very interesting to see that you can even play an exchange sack back as black, where you sort of make the point that even though white is going to be up material technically after like c6 and knight e6, the position is actually still going to be better for black because of this massive cluster of pawns that are moving on the queen side, where in the process of regaining the material, white kind of lost the momentum he had before. And very instructive variation, maybe a little bit computerish given that, black didn't play this way in the game. But the move f5, sort of a more practical move saying, let's just keep the position closed and try to keep things stable. We had knight e5, knight f6, and there's sort of the point, like, to this stage, I think both players played pretty much the best moves virtually every move, but here, or very close to it at the very least. But here it turns out queen c2 by Prague is probably a bit of a mistake, even though it's true that, when you have a when your position is sharp, like, I mean, no human is going to play it perfectly for the whole game, of course. But in this case, white should probably either just bring the final piece into play, just like make sure all of the pieces are involved in the battle before doing anything too direct. Also, bishop g5 would be possible, but does strike me as a bit less natural than rook fe1, I suppose. But yeah, it is one way you can play it. After queen c2, yeah, black played the move of c6, just kind of stabilizing d5 in advance. Note, by the way, if you do play g6, it's not the end of the world, but you are kind of weakening your king a little bit in the long term, which is not completely ideal. I mean, the engine still says black's better, but yeah, you do have to be a little bit careful in these positions as well. And move for black that probably was really good was to play c5 and, you know, just go for the d4 push, which is actually quite hard for white to deal with, as it turns out. But in a game, c6 was played. You know, we can sort of see already that both players were getting quite low on time because the position is just very, very complicated. And once again, I think probably rook e1, you know, should be played sooner rather than later. Just thinking in terms of what maybe was the reason why white didn't play it. I mean, my first was maybe he's nervous about knight e4, but you do have queen h3, and it's not like you have a super great follow-up. You know, white's quite happy just to trade on c3. Because, like, if you play bishop a3, I mean, it's just, it grabs a pawn, like, there's no instant refutation, but, you know, I can even just play f4 and just keep pushing in the center, and, you know, even just cashing in the chips with knight d7 and just regaining the exchange at some point is also going to be quite good. So, yeah, white played knight f7 instead, which is probably just not the best move order. Turns out even just sacking the exchanges is actually a really good position for black, where the two pawns and knight are actually a lot better than the rook in this position, as the rook only really has one open file to work with, and again, the pawn armada is going to come at some stage. Black played bishop c8, which is also a good move, setting up a pin here. And after rook fe1, once again, maybe the best bet is just to sack the exchange and just play that position where material is close to equal, but black has a very nice strategic advantage. Also, one thing I didn't mention before, but probably also worth noting, that, you know, in a position like this, we can see how passive the g2 bishop is, just hitting this brick wall, and, you know, can't even activate h3 in this instance. So it's part of the reason why white is really struggling here. The game instead saw knight b7, which sort of allows white some chances to try to get out of this. The computer is giving some really crazy ideas where you, like, sacrifice, you know, a rook with knight d5, and somehow you still have, like, really good compensation with, you know, with the bishop being, like, really strong. Very interesting example of domination, and yeah, very computerish yet to, you know, just give up a whole rook like this. To Prague's credit, after bishop g5 and the move rook a7, he did realize on the second go that you can actually play this sack, and did play take. And yeah, if you don't play bishop d5, like, it's not really clear where your attack is kind of going. But I mean, white does keep an initiative here, and black does have to be quite precise. Technically, you can get away with bishop b2, but it does look kind of, you know, a bit, you could say, risky and lacking a sense of danger. Whereas Gukesh's bishop e7, yeah, definitely is more solid to block the e-pawn as such. And here is where white basically has to find exactly the right moves, and if he does, he will hold, but if not, he will kind of just, his attack will get beaten back and he'll just be down material. So the move that white had to find in the game was knight to h6, takes, and now queen to g4. The point being that king h8 runs into a queen d4 fork, forking the king and the rook. But after bishop g5, it turns out that, well, white can play queen d4 anyway, is one nice point. You know, if rook a8, you have knight. Well, I was going to say knight c7, but actually the real point is that you go e7 first and then knight c7, because then you're winning the queen, not just the rook as such. But yeah, if they play this sequence, yeah, you can also just go knight d8 and, you know, give up the rook on your own terms and have this weird position where black has two minor pieces for a rook, but the king is very exposed, and this sort of allows white to basically be okay here with some quite direct play, just not really giving black the time to fully consolidate his forces. But yeah, it's also true you could play a move like f4 or h4 as well, and yeah, that would also be adequate here for white. But in the game, white played queen g4 first, trying to refine this idea, but now Gukesh has found a very, very good response. in knight d8, just avoiding any knight going back and forth. And yeah, after takes, black is basically up a piece. He just has to untangle a bit and make sure not to allow any tricks with e7 in the future. So queen d4, rook b7. Notice how black's just keeping everything protected, not allowing any fluke tactics, which in time pressure is something you want to be mindful of. Rook e4, bishop e6. And yeah, everything is just very well played for black, just keeping the control, not letting white push the pawn. h4, queen c6. And I mean, maybe white's moves aren't the very best, but it doesn't matter by now because the position is just completely winning for black. And after e6, bishop e6, h6, and rook f2. White resigned here, like he's down a piece. There's going to be discoveries coming. So, yeah, very, very nice game by Gukesh. And, it goes to show, like, that, I think earlier, like, in round one, I had sort of written off, like, the chances of, Prague and Gukesh and Vidit a bit. But looking at these games, yeah, we can see that, Vidit and Gukesh aren't equal first. And they're in, like, really good form in this tournament. So, yeah, I think that, definitely shouldn't sleep on their chances. Let's put it like this. Now, the final game I want to share for this recap, and as you notice, this one was a little bit longer than the round one because the game's just been more interesting. But yeah, our final game is between Nepomniachtchi against Firouzja. And this one was, I think, a very impressive game by Nepomniachtchi for sure. Like the Vidit game, like Vidit found some really great moves, but it's also true that Nakamura, just kind of played well below his usual level. Whereas in this game, you really feel that Nepo kind of outplayed Firouzja, like, without any sort of, the opponent just collapsing or something, but he really, like, put a lot of pressure on him. And you may recall, yeah, this was actually from Nakamura Vidit with the move d6, but yeah, with this game, we see a bit more of a dynamic approach where white takes, we get this more open center, and black does have more space, but it's also true that, that pawn can potentially become a target, and white, yeah, is going to try and set some problems with his own, like with some active piece play. Note, by the way, that grabbing a pawn with b5 is actually not so advisable here, because even though you do win a pawn, black ends up getting very, very good compensation here. Even a move like a6 is quite nice, where you kind of just prompt white to, leave himself quite a few pawn weaknesses. Black has the bishop here as well. It's just a sort of deceptively very bad position for white in a sense. Of course, these players notice, and Nepo played knight d2, being a bit more flexible, and, giving b5 maybe a little bit more strength to come. So black plays a6, a4, bishop f5, making a point that, d3 is no less weak than e5 here. Queen c2, knight d5, and you can figure from the speed of the play, that the players obviously had prepared this before the game. Well, before the tournament, of course. Bishop g4, and yeah, this is where things start to get very very interesting, because this move that Nepo played of queen to a2, it only been played in one game previously. Like normally people just played knight e1 and, just made sure the knight wasn't going to get, taken and the pawn's doubled. But knight e1's also a little bit passive. Like it's pretty clear that, you're not really going to be better as white in a position like this, let's say. There's a normal sort of structure for the opening. Get like this, for example. But the move queen a2, yeah, sort of indicates Nepo's fighting spirit, saying, okay, I'll let you take on f3, and I'll even let you take my pawn on d3, but I get some compensation for it. And it's of a more long-term nature where, I already threatened rook d1 to trap the queen, so the queen has to run as it did in the game, rook d1, queen e8. And yeah, in this position, like, it might seem as though, black's just up a pawn with no weaknesses. But white does have the bishop pair of this very strong battery. White does have a lead in development. The black pieces are a little bit passive, especially the knights. And with the move h4, yeah, Nepo is just saying, well, I'm just going to ram this pawn down the board and just create weaknesses against the black king. So very, very instructive. And yeah, I think that at this point it's possible maybe Nepo was trying to recollect his preparation here, because h4 is not the top line of the engine. It prefers to go f4 and try to open things up in this way, or, to play a move like bishop e3, be a more patient approach. But, I think h4, there's nothing terribly wrong with this move, and I think that, practically speaking, it did ask some pretty tough questions of black in the game. Supposedly the best defense is just to go king h8 and sort of meet knight g5 with knight d8, which looks very awkward, but it's actually quite hard to break. And black can sort of start to kick the knight away with f6 and later f5. So it's really, I think, going to be quite okay for black if he just kind of hunkers down and just plays really solidly like this. Note, by the way, that rook d8 does get back the pawn, but it's not really in the spirit of how white wants to play it, because in this case the weaknesses around the king become progressively more important, and we sort of lose our initiative by cashing in too early. So it's kind of a good thing to keep in mind. In the game, black played knight c8, which would improve the worst placed piece. You can't really criticize this move, I think. h5, king h8. I mean, you could also go h6 and stop this pawn advance. Like, this may be a possible improvement for black, like intending to, just go for this kind of setup. At least would avoid some of the problems that ensued in the game later on. So h6, g5 is a very nice move by Firouzja, realizing that, bishop g5 is just not playable because, rook g8 and the knight will simply be lost with the pin on the king. So white goes queen to d2 instead. Very creative move trying to bring the queen into d7. You could probably argue that an approach like rook g1 and, trying to regain the pawn this way might be better. But it also does kind of let black off the hook a little bit if they're able to, just simplify and liquidate that way. So queen e2 keeps a bit more tension in the position. Knight d6, bishop b2. Yeah, I think this is probably one of the key moments of the game where, in retrospect, I think Firouzja's knight f5 trying to win the pawn and counterattack is probably not the most precise, where a more patient approach like f6 and, just playing to kind of get rid of the pawn in this way with queen g6. I mean, it's very hard to find a weakness in black's position. Like, yeah, the light squares are a bit loose, but it's hard to really derive something meaningful from that currently. And I think black is probably just going to be better here, in fact. Because, yeah, as I said, queen e2 is probably not the most precise. But in the end, after knight f5, yeah, white sort of gets rewarded a little bit for his play here. With the queen being on d7, yeah, it's just kind of going to be quite hard for black to unravel, let's say. Note, by the way, that if black does play knight takes h6, white can flick in this b5 move, and even though white is currently down 2 pawns, it turns out that white is actually better here, as the black knight's sort of a bit discombobulated. White can sort of regain the pawn at different moments with queen c7, and if black tries to defend everything, you've got moves like c4, where you're just able to threaten this pawn and kind of play for this very long-term sort of domination. Like, if we get a position like this, we can even, play c5 and bring our bishop to life. And it's surprisingly hard for black to kind of coordinate and consolidate his position here. So it seems like a very, very nice example of the nature of long-term compensation in general. And once knight h4 is played, it's sort of it's a committal move to let the pawn stay alive and, have this very sharp position, but it is the right approach. Well, after f5, this knight is getting kicked around a bit. Knight g3. Knight takes f3 was played, and yeah, position is just completely unclear at this stage. Where after the move b5, black played the move of f4, which, yeah, it turns out like knight a5 is the other move black could play, but yeah, after bishop a2, there's still the question of how black kind of gets his play going, and it does appear this position is probably better for white in a very, very unclear setting, just because of black's struggles to kind of untangle. Note, by the way, that taking would actually be a mistake. Like, normally on your up material, you just trade the queen, so everything is fine, but yeah, after bishop d6 and rook d1, like, white has just got so much power, like, behind his pieces, where, like, already, yeah, the threat just to go b6 and just overwhelm the defense this way, and there's not a lot black can really do to avoid it. Like, if you play rook fd8, you're just still running into the move b6, because if black takes, c4, or even better, just knight takes f5, yeah, it's true. You could have done the previous move as well, but it's more effective when the bishop is actually threatened. And yeah, there's a very long analysis, but kind of shows like an example of the nature of white's compensation. And you've got this sort of windmill with the bishop and the knight, and there's not a lot black can really do about that. So yeah, a long variation, but kind of shows like the nature of white's compensation quite nicely. In the game, Firouzja played f4, this little intermediate move, to which it's kind of interesting to see the computer actually wants to take and, just play the endgame, sort of having this long-term domination of the position. As it actually proved surprisingly hard for black to actually round up the pawn on h6. But yeah, it's still quite complex, of course, but white will have some pressure. The move in the game, knight e4, is definitely more normal for a human point of view, because, yeah, normally when you're down material, you do want to keep the queens on, or at least make it where they trade on their terms. In this case, the move knight a5 is probably where things start to unravel a little bit for black, let's say, where in hindsight he has to just sort of go for broke with queen at h5. Yeah, it's a bit of a loud background noise, so I don't know if you guys can hear it or not, but I think my noise suppression should be okay. But yeah, the point of queen h5 is that after b takes c6, black will play knight h2, and there's basically no good way out of the checks. Like, king g2 f3 is sort of getting mated, and yeah, if you go king g1, they just keep checking with the knight, and have king g2, knight h4, and you have this weird kind of shuffle going on, where after king f1, knight f5, yeah, it turns out that black is down a piece, but does have, some quite real threats, like queen h4 to get the piece back. And after bishop d5 to defend against that, we have takes, and like white finds some more really crazy moves as well, like c4 is, pretty obviously a computer move in this case. But yeah, after something like, let's say, takes, bishop e5, the dust ultimately settles into this very, ultimately sells into itself some kind of endgame with like bishop c7, and yeah, in the end, like the outline's gone, like just it's me just sort of showing engine lines at this point, but black is sort of able, to kind of liquidate and, basically save the draw in this way as such. Just all the pawns will get hoovered off the board, essentially. Yeah, in the game, black played knight a5 instead of queen h5, and yeah, it meant that after, well, it turns out technically you should probably play bishop a2, but bishop e6 is probably the better move from the human point of view, just kind of keeping an eye on the king side as such. And yeah, Firouzja in time pressure didn't really manage to find the only defense to stay in the game. What the black had to find here was this move of g4, which, as I did, you can't just take it, because knight h2 and black are sort of able to, trade off the bishop in that way and neutralize white's attack. But if white plays c4 instead, just going for the attack, well, black gets some ideas as well, like knight b3, and you're sort of able to bring the knight to d4 and get the queen to h5, and in that way black suddenly is able to kind of survive with this sort of counter attack. Still a very, very crazy position. Like, for example, the engineer's giving the move king g2, which is just like a cold-bloodedly quiet sort of move in this position. But yeah, this is the way that black had to defend, and well, yeah, it's kind of a case where either you find this or you basically just lose the game as black. And queen g6, I mean, obviously Firouzja knew that this was giving up a piece, but I think he just couldn't find anything better in time pressure. But yeah, Nepomniachtchi just defended quite well. Like bishop f7 was a nice move to make sure after queen h1 that there's no queen h5 to get this machination against the white king. In the game after queen h3, white was basically able to consolidate. Like bishop d5 was a nice move to defend the knight and keep the center blockaded and just keep things stable. Queen c7, queen g4, and it might look a little bit scary with the king being in the center, but after c4 everything is just covered really well here, where the move rook d5 is probably the best try, but yeah, take queen h3, knight g3, and there's just nothing that the black can do. Like white's just going to take on e5 and just neutralize by just taking everything with check, basically. Something like this would be a demonstration. You just trade the queens and just win, essentially. So in the game we had knight c4, queen takes, fg3, but at the end of the day white is just a rook up here, and yeah, rook h1, nice little intermezzo, keeping control, and he played a few more moves just in case, but yeah, at this point, black resigned. Just nothing black can do, being a rook down here. So yeah, this was a very exciting round of the candidates, and yeah, 4 decisive games where I actually can't even remember the last time there were 4 out of 4 decisive games in the candidates tournament. But yeah, with the standings, we now have basically Vidit, Caruana, Gukesh, and Nepomniachtchi all on 1.5 out of 2, with the other 4 players on half out of 2. So clearly, yeah, the players are out for blood, like playing very fighting chess. And because the players are really bringing the fights, like all of them, it does mean that, they're required to score to win the event may be higher than usual. Because in the past, like +3 score was usually enough to kind of win the candidates. But this time, yeah, it might be a score of +4 or +5 that is needed if, there are several players stringing together a lot of wins against each other as such. But yeah, it will be interesting to see what unfolds for sure. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next recap for round 3. And also let me know, what was your favorite move or your favorite game from this round, as it were. If you are interested in private lessons with me, I do have some spots still available, so feel free to send me a message on Facebook or to send me an email, and yeah, we'll get back to you at some stage. So yeah, on that note, I will see you all in the next recap, and until then, take care.